In the glittering halls of Harwood Palace, a priceless royal tiara vanishes during a lavish state dinner, plunging guests into a web of suspicion. Was it the charming diplomat with secrets to hide, the desperate maid burdened by debt, the fiery chef with a temper, or the proud noblewoman masking her losses? Only Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and quiet wisdom, can unravel the truth hidden in whispers, glances, and a single empty cloth bundle. A classic mystery of greed, deception, and secrets waiting to be solved. Chapter 1. The glitter of the evening, the dining hall of Harwood Palace shimmered with an elegance that spoke of centuries past. Its high ceilings adorned with gilded cornices, and its walls lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors. Crystal chandeliers cast a soft, prismatic glow over the long mahogany table, where silver cutlery gleamed beside delicate porcelain plates. The air carried the faint scent of beeswax polish and the roses arranged in towering centerpieces. It was a state dinner, a grand affair to honor Monsieur Claude Villette, a diplomat from a small but strategically vital duchy nestled in the Alps. The occasion demanded perfection, and the palace staff had ensured no detail was overlooked. At the heart of the evening's splendor, displayed on a raised dais at the far end of the hall, was the royal tiara. Encased in glass, it rested on a cushion of deep blue velvet, its diamonds and sapphires catching the light with a fire that drew every eye. The tiara, a relic of 300 years, had adorned the brows of queens and princesses, its history whispered in tales of coronations and betrayals. Its presence tonight was a gesture of trust to the visiting diplomat, a symbol of the alliance Lord Harwood sought to strengthen. Guests murmured in admiration, their voices a low hum beneath the clink of glasses and the soft strains of a string quartet. Miss Jane Marple, seated at the table's quieter end, seemed an unlikely figure amidst such grandeur. A slight woman, with white hair neatly pinned and a shawl draped over her shoulders, she might have been mistaken for a harmless spinster, invited out of courtesy as Lady Harwood's distant cousin. Her knitting needles moved with a steady rhythm, producing a length of pale blue wool that spilled into her lap. But her eyes, sharp and bright behind her spectacles, missed nothing. She noted the way Monsieur Villette's smile lingered too long on his hostess, the way the young maid, Ellen Carter, fumbled a silver tray with trembling hands, the way Chef Antonio Rossi's booming laugh carried from the kitchen doorway, and the way Lady Beatrice Langley's gaze fixed on the tiara with a hunger that belied her aloof demeanor. The dinner progressed through its courses: consomme, poached salmon, roast pheasant each dish, a testament to Rossi's skill. Lord Harwood, a robust man with a penchant for pomp, rose to toast the alliance, his voice resonant with pride. "To friendship between our nations," he declared, raising his glass, "and to the treasures that bind us." The guests echoed the toast, their eyes drifting to the tiara, which seemed to pulse with light. Miss Marple sipped her wine, her thoughts less on the speech than on the undercurrents in the room. She had a way of sensing when things were not quite right, a knack honed in the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead, where human nature revealed itself in small, telling ways. As the dessert course, a delicate lemon soufflé, was served, Ellen Carter moved among the guests, her face pale and her steps hesitant. Miss Marple watched her pause near the tiara's case, adjusting a napkin on her tray. The girl's eyes flicked toward the glass, then away, as if afraid to linger. Monsieur Villette, seated near Lady Harwood, leaned forward to murmur something that made her laugh, but his glance strayed to the dais. Lady Beatrice, adjusting her emerald necklace, commented loudly on the tiara's craftsmanship, her voice carrying a note of envy. Rossi emerged briefly from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a cloth, his eyes scanning the room before he retreated. The quartet struck up a new piece, and the guests' attention turned to their plates. Miss Marple's needles paused as she observed the scene, her mind cataloging details, the distance from the table to the dais, the number of exits, the positions of the staff. Then, a sudden scream shattered the harmony. It came from Lady Harwood, who had risen to admire the tiara more closely. "It's gone," she cried, her hand pressed to her chest. "The tiara's gone." The room froze, then erupted. Guests stood, craning to see the empty case, its velvet cushion bare. Lord Harwood's face turned crimson as he bellowed for the doors to be sealed. Footmen rushed to comply, their polished shoes echoing on the marble floor. The quartet faltered, their music dying away. Miss Marple remained seated, her knitting untouched, her eyes moving from face to face. Ellen Carter stood rooted, her tray clutched tightly. Monsieur Villette's expression was one of polite concern, though his fingers tapped the table. Lady Beatrice's indignation was immediate, her voice sharp as she demanded an explanation. Rossi, reappearing at the kitchen door, looked thunderstruck, his hands still gripping the cloth. Lord Harwood strode to the case, his hands shaking as he examined the lock. "It's not broken," he muttered. "How could this happen?" The guests whispered among themselves, their theories ranging from audacious thieves to palace conspiracies. Miss Marple, unnoticed in the commotion, slipped closer to the dais. The glass was unmarred, the lock undisturbed. No shards, no signs of violence. A subtle hand, she thought, her lips pursing slightly. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing. As the butler summoned the local constable, Miss Marple returned to her seat, her knitting resumed. The room buzzed with speculation, but she remained silent, her mind already turning over the possibilities. She had seen such things before, in villages and grand houses alike. Greed, desperation, pride, the motives were always the same, only the settings changed. "Someone in this room knows more than they will say," she murmured to herself, her needles clicking softly, "and I shall find out who." Chapter 2. The scene of the crime, the dining hall of Harwood Palace. So recently, a stage 4 elegance and diplomacy had transformed into a tableau of suspicion and disarray. The chandeliers still gleamed, casting their light over the now disordered table, where half-eaten soufflés sat, abandoned beside overturned wineglasses. The royal tiara's empty glass case stood like a silent accusation at the room's end, its velvet cushion starkly bare. The guests, moments ago toasting alliances, now stood in clusters, their voices a low murmur of shock and speculation. Lord Harwood, his face a mottled shade of crimson, paced before the dais, muttering about disgrace and dishonor. Lady Harwood, pale but composed, sat fanning herself, her eyes darting toward the sealed doors. Miss Jane Marple, unnoticed amidst the chaos, remained in her chair near the table's edge, her knitting needles moving with a calm, steady rhythm. Her shawl was neatly draped over her shoulders, and her spectacles glinted faintly as she observed the room. To the casual eye, she was merely an elderly spinster, perhaps overwhelmed by the evening's drama, but her mind was as sharp as the needles in her hands, cataloging every detail, the way the footmen hovered uncertainly near the exits, the way the string quartet had retreated to a corner, their instruments abandoned, and the way the 4 key figures in the room, Monsieur Claude Ville, Ellen Carter, Antonio Rossi, and Lady Beatrice Langley, betrayed their unease in subtle, telling ways. The arrival of Inspector Grayson, the local constable, brought a semblance of order, a wiry man with a clipped mustache and a known-sense air. He strode into the hall with a notebook tucked under his arm and a sergeant trailing behind. His gray eyes swept the room, taking in the opulence and the tension with equal measure. "Nobody leaves," he announced, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "This is a crime scene now." The footmen, already stationed at the doors, nodded nervously, their polished demeanor fraying under the weight of the moment. Miss Marple's needles paused as she watched Grayson approach the empty case. He examined it with a frown, his fingers tracing the smooth glass and the unblemished lock. "No sign of tampering," he muttered to his sergeant, a young man named Brooks, who scribbled notes furiously. The thief knew what they were doing. This wasn't a chandagrab. Grayson's gaze shifted to the guests, his expression hardening. Someone in this room has the answers, and I'll have them, mark my words. Lord Harwood, still pacing, rounded on the inspector. This is an outrage, Grayson. That tiara is worth a king's ransom, not to mention its historical value. It was my responsibility, and now? He broke off, running a hand through his thinning hair. Lady Harwood rose, placing a calming hand on his arm. Reginald, please. Let the inspector do his work. Her voice was steady, but Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in her fingers, the way her eyes avoided the empty case. Grayson began his inquiries with the efficiency of a man accustomed to petty thefts, though the scale of this crime clearly unsettled him. He called for the guests to remain seated and for the staff to assemble near the kitchen entrance. Miss Marple, unnoticed, slipped closer to the dais, her small frame blending into the shadows cast by a towering floral arrangement. She knelt ostensibly to retrieve a dropped knitting needle, but her eyes scanned the floor. The marble was pristine, save for a faint scuff mark near the case's base, barely noticeable unless one looked for it. Interesting, she murmured, straightening up. The mark suggested movement a shoe, perhaps, or the edge of a tool, but it was too vague to be conclusive. Still, she filed it away, her mind already turning over possibilities. Grayson's first questions were directed at the assembled guests. Did anyone leave the room during the dinner? He asked, his pencil poised. A chorus of denials followed, each voice tinged with varying degrees of indignation or nervousness. Monsieur Villette, seated with an air of unruffled calm, spread his hands. I was engaged in conversation with Lady Harwood all evening, Inspector. I had no occasion to wander. His accent was smooth, his smile practiced, but Miss Marple noted the way his left hand rested lightly on the table, fingers tapping a faint rhythm, a nervous habit, perhaps, or a sign of something more. Ellen Carter, the maid, stood near the kitchen door with the other staff, her face pale and her hands twisting in her apron. When Grayson called her forward, she approached with halting steps, her eyes fixed on the floor. I was clearing plates, sir, she said softly. I didn't see anything, I mean. Her voice cracked, and she flushed, glancing toward the dais. Grayson's eyes narrowed. You were near the case, girl. Did you touch it? Ellen shook her head vehemently, her hands clutching her apron tighter. No, sir, I swear it. Grayson dismissed her with a grunt, but Miss Marple's gaze lingered. The girl's fear was palpable, but was it the fear of guilt or of being wrongly accused? Miss Marple had seen both in her time, and she knew they could look remarkably alike. Antonio Rossi, the chef, was next, his presence announced by the faint scent of herbs and flour that clung to his whites. He stood with his arms crossed, his broad face flushed from the kitchen's heater, perhaps from nerves. I was in the kitchen, Inspector, he said, his voice loud and tinged with an Italian accent. The soufflé, it takes precision. I don't have time to steal jewels. His laugh was forced, and Miss Marple noticed a smudge of flour on his cuff, out of place for a man who prided himself on his meticulousness. Grayson pressed him on his movements, but Rossi insisted he had only stepped into the hall briefly to check on the service, ask the waiters. He bellowed, gesturing toward the staff. Grayson made a note, his expression skeptical. Lady Beatrice Langley, seated near the head of the table, did not wait to be called. She rose, her silk gown rustling, and fixed Grayson with a haughty stare. This is absurd, Inspector. Do you imagine I, a Langley, would stoop to theft? Her diamond earrings caught the light, rivaling the absent tiara in their brilliance. She admitted to admiring the tiara during dinner, her seat offering a clear view of the dais. It's a magnificent piece, but I have no need of it, she said, her tone dripping with disdain. Grayson, unintimidated, asked if she had left her seat. Only to the powder room, briefly, she replied, her lips tightening. Miss Marple noted the timing. Lady Beatrice's absence had coincided with the dessert course, just before the theft was discovered. A coincidence, perhaps, but Miss Marple did not believe in coincidences without cause. As Grayson continued his questions, Miss Marple moved quietly to the edge of the dais, her eyes scanning the case once more. The lock was a delicate mechanism, designed to be opened with a key kept by Lord Harwood himself. She bent closer, her fingers brushing the velvet cushion. A faint indentation remained where the tiara had rested, but no other clues presented themselves. The glass was spotless, the hinges undisturbed. A clever thief, she thought, her lips pursing slightly. Someone with access, or someone who planned carefully. The tiara was too large to be slipped into a pocket unnoticed, yet it had vanished without a trace. She glanced at the exits, the main doors, now guarded, and the service corridor leading to the kitchen. A possibility, perhaps, but the corridor was narrow and frequently used by staff. A thief would need nerve and timing. Grayson, meanwhile, had turned his attention to the staff. The footmen and waiters confirmed they had been busy, serving their movements accounted for by their colleagues. One waiter, a young man named Thomas, hesitated when asked about the service corridor. "It's always busy, sir," he said, his eyes flickering toward Ellen. "But I didn't see nothing unusual." Grayson pressed him, but Thomas offered no more, his hands fidgeting. Miss Marple made a mental note. The boy's nervousness could mean nothing or everything. In her experience, those on the fringes of a crime often saw more than they realized. The inspector's questions grew repetitive, and the guests' patience wore thin. Lord Harwood demanded progress, his voice rising. "This is a national embarrassment, Grayson. That tiara belongs to the crown." Grayson, unruffled, promised a thorough investigation. "We'll search the premises and question everyone again, if need be," he said, his tone firm. Lady Harwood, ever the diplomat's wife, suggested the guests retire to the drawing room while the police worked. "We mustn't let this ruin the evening entirely," she said, though her smile was strained. As the guests filed out, Miss Marple lingered, her knitting tucked into her bag. She approached the service corridor, ostensibly to retrieve her shawl, which she had deliberately left on a chair. The corridor was dimly lit, its walls lined with faded wallpaper. A small window, high on the wall, caught her eye. It was unlatched, its frame slightly askew. She reached up, her fingers brushing the sill. No dust, no cobwebs, recently used, perhaps. The window was too small for a person, but a tiara could fit through it. "A clever escape," she murmured, her mind turning to the courtyard beyond. She would need to examine it in daylight. Returning to the hall, she found Grayson conferring with his sergeant. "The thief had to be quick," he was saying. "The tiara was there during the main course. I saw it myself when I arrived for security. By dessert, it was gone. That's a window of, 20 minutes? Sergeant Brooks nodded, scribbling. Miss Marple cleared her throat softly. "Inspector, might I suggest checking the staff's quarters? A thief might hide something there, temporarily." Grayson raised an eyebrow, clearly unused to suggestions from elderly ladies. "We'll get to it, ma'am," he said, his tone polite but dismissive. Miss Marple smiled faintly. She was accustomed to being underestimated. As the guests dispersed, Miss Marple took a final look at the four suspects. Monsieur Villette stood by the fireplace, sipping brandy, his calm unshaken, but his eyes watchful. Ellen Carter had retreated to the kitchen, her shoulders hunched. Rossi was arguing with a waiter, his voice carrying through the door. Lady Beatrice, adjusting her shawl, swept out with an air of offended dignity. Each, Miss Marple thought, had opportunity, and each had something to hide. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen such behaviors before: greed disguised as charm, desperation masked as duty, pride cloaking need. The tiara is only part of the story, she thought. her needles resuming their rhythm as she joined the others in the drawing room. The truth lies in the people. The evening drew to a close, the guests retiring to their rooms under the watchful eyes of Grayson's men. Miss Marple, her mind alive with possibilities, sat by her window, her knitting forgotten. The palace, with its secrets and shadows, was not so different from her village. People, she knew, were the same everywhere, driven by wants and fears, their actions leaving ripples that a keen eye could trace. She would watch, and she would listen. The Tiara would be found, and with it, the truth. Chapter 3. The diplomats charmed the drawing room of Harwood Palace. Where the guests had retreated after the dining hall's upheaval, was a study in restrained opulence. Its walls, papered in soft green damask, were adorned with landscapes in heavy gilt frames, and a fire crackled in the marble hearth, casting a warm glow over the assembled company. The air was thick with tension, the earlier camaraderie of the state dinner replaced by wary glances and guarded whispers. The royal tiara's theft had cast a pall over the evening, and though the guests sipped brandy or tea, their thoughts were clearly elsewhere. Miss Jane Marple sat in a high-backed chair near a window, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on her pale blue wool. Her position offered a clear view of the room, and she used it to observe the four individuals who had drawn her attention: Monsieur Claude Villette, the diplomat; Ellen Carter, the maid; Antonio Rossi, the chef; and Lady Beatrice Langley, the noble. Each, she knew, held a piece of the puzzle, and her task was to fit those pieces together. For now, her focus settled on Villette, whose polished demeanor seemed almost too perfect for the circumstances. Inspector Grayson, having concluded his initial inquiries in the dining hall, had requested private interviews with the key suspects. The library, a room of dark oak shelves and leather-bound volumes, was chosen for its privacy. Monsieur Villette was summoned first, and Miss Marple, with a quiet word to Lady Harwood about needing to stretch her legs, followed discreetly. She positioned herself in an alcove just outside the library door, where a conveniently placed chair and a half-open curtain allowed her to listen without being seen. Her knitting continued, a harmless prop that belied the sharpness of her attention. Villette entered the library with the grace of a man accustomed to navigating delicate situations. His tailored suit, a deep charcoal that complemented his silk hair, gave him an air of effortless authority. He took the offered seat opposite Grayson, crossing one leg over the other and folding his hands in his lap. "Inspector," he began, his voice smooth with a faint continental accent, "this is a most unfortunate incident. I assure you, I am as eager as you to see the tiara recovered." Grayson, seated behind a mahogany desk, fixed Villette with a steady gaze. "Monsieur Villette, let's start with your movements tonight. You say you were at the table all evening, but we've a witness, a footman who saw you leave briefly during the fish course. Care to explain?" Villette's smile did not waver, though Miss Marple, listening through the crack in the door, noted a slight tightening of his jaw. "A simple matter, Inspector," he replied. "I received an urgent call from my embassy, a minor diplomatic issue, nothing more. I stepped into the antechamber to take it privately. Surely you don't suspect me of pilfering jewels in the midst of a phone call?" His tone was light, almost amused, but his fingers twitched, brushing the cuff of his sleeve. Grayson's pencil scratched across his notebook. "And this call, can anyone confirm it? The footman says you were gone for nearly 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Villette raised an eyebrow, his expression one of mild surprise. "I assure you, it was no more than 5. The antechamber is just off the dining hall, as you know." I spoke briefly, returned, and resumed my conversation with Lady Harwood. "She can vouch for me, I'm sure." Miss Marple's needles paused. The antechamber, she recalled, was a small room used for private calls or brief respites. Its door visible from the dining hall, but not from the dais where the tiara had been displayed. 10 minutes was ample time for a practiced hand to slip to the case, especially if the lock's key was accessible. Lord Harwood, she had learned from a passing remark by the butler, kept the key in his study, a room not far from the antechamber. A diplomat, trained in discretion and quick thinking, might well know how to seize such an opportunity. Grayson pressed further. "You've an interest in fine things, Monsieur Villette. You were heard commenting on the tiara's beauty during dinner. Any particular reason for that?" Villette laughed softly, a sound that carried the charm of a man used to deflecting suspicion. "Inspector, I am a guest in a palace renowned for its treasures. The tiara is exquisite, a symbol of your nation's heritage. Of course I admired it, but admiration is not theft. I have no need for such baubles. My position provides me with all I require." His tone was smooth, but Miss Marple caught the faintest edge of defensiveness, a crack in his polished facade. The inspector leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Your position? Yes. Diplomatic immunity must be convenient. Makes it hard to search your rooms, doesn't it?" Villette's smile tightened, but he spread his hands in a gesture of openness. "Search them if you must, Inspector. You'll find nothing but papers and a few personal effects. I am here to foster goodwill, not to steal." His voice was steady, but Miss Marple noted the way his fingers lingered on his cuff again, as if checking for something or ensuring it was not there. Grayson made a note, his expression unreadable. "We'll see about that. For now, you're free to return to the drawing room. Don't leave the palace." Violet rose, offering a slight bow before exiting. As he passed the alcove, Miss Marple bent over her knitting, her face a mask of innocent absorption. But her mind was racing. Villette's story was plausible, but his manner suggested a man accustomed to secrets. Diplomats, she knew from village. Gossip about a certain ambassador's indiscretions in St. Mary Mead often played roles beyond their official duties. Was Villette merely a guest, or was he entangled in something deeper? Back in the drawing room, Miss Marple resumed her seat, her eyes following Villette as he rejoined the guests. He accepted a brandy from a footman and struck up a conversation with a minor peer, his laughter easy and his posture relaxed. But she noticed the way his gaze flicked toward the door, as if expecting someone or something. She recalled a snippet from her nephew Raymond, who had once dined with a diplomat suspected of smuggling. "They're trained to be charming," he had said, "but charm hides a multitude of sins." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Villette's scenes, if they existed, would not remain hidden for long. She turned her attention to the other suspects, who had been left to wait while Grayson conducted his interviews. Ellen Carter stood near the service table, her hand still twisting in her apron. She had not been called yet, but her nervousness was evident in the way she avoided eye contact, her gaze fixed on the carpet. Antonio Rossi, having returned from a brief absence to check on his kitchen, stood by the hearth, his loud voice regaling a group with tales of his culinary triumphs. Yet his eyes darted toward the door, and his hands, Miss Marple noted, were unusually still for a man so animated. Lady Beatrice Langley sat apart, her posture rigid, her fan moving with sharp, impatient snaps. She had declined to join the others' conversations, her expression one of affronted dignity. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to Villette's phone call. The antechamber's proximity to the study, where the tiara's key was kept, was troubling. Had he slipped into the study during his absence? Or had he an accomplice, someone who could pass the tiara to him unnoticed? The footman's estimate of 10 minutes suggested more than a brief call, and Villette's insistence on 5 minutes felt like a careful adjustment. She made a mental note to ask the butler about the study's security and whether Villette had been seen near it. As the evening wore on, the guests grew restless, their polite facades fraying. Lord Harwood, who had joined the drawing room after a heated discussion with Grayson, paced before the fire, muttering about the tiara's loss. "It's not just the value," he said to no one in particular. "It's the trust. The crown entrusted it to me, and now it's gone. Lady Harwood, ever the peacemaker, murmured soothing words, but her eyes were tired, her composure strained. Miss Marple, her knitting a steady rhythm, considered the tiara itself, its size large and ornate, with a distinctive sapphire centerpiece, it difficult to conceal. A thief would need a plan to remove it from the palace, or a place to hide it until suspicion passed. The service corridor, with its unlatched window, was one possibility, but Villette, as a guest, would have limited access to such areas. Unless, she thought, he had cultivated an ally among the staff. Her gaze drifted to Ellen, whose pale face and trembling hands suggested a burden heavier than a maid's usual duties. The library door opened, and Grayson emerged, his notebook tucked under his arm. He glanced at Miss Marple, his expression softening slightly. "You're still here, ma'am. Best get some rest. This could take a while." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. "Oh, I'm quite comfortable, Inspector. I find these evenings so instructive." Grayson nodded, clearly unsure what to make of her, and called for Ellen Carter to be next. As the maid shuffled toward the library, Miss Marple's needles clicked faster. Villette's charm was a mask, she was certain, but masks could slip. She would watch him closely, just as she would watch the others. In St. Mary Mead, she had unraveled mysteries by listening to the small things gossip, glances, hesitations. Here, in the grandeur of Harwood Palace, the same rules applied. People are people, she thought, her lips curving slightly, and secrets have a way of coming to light. Chapter 4. The Maid's Burden. The library of Harwood Palace, with its towering shelves and the faint scent of aged leather, was a sanctuary of quiet authority, but tonight it felt more like a courtroom. The fire in the grate cast flickering shadows across the oak-paneled walls, and the single lamp on the desk threw a harsh light on Ellen Carter, the young maid, as she stood before Inspector Grayson. Her slight frame seemed to shrink under his scrutiny, her hands twisting the hem of her starched apron until the fabric threatened to tear. Her face, pale and drawn, bore the marks of sleepless nights, and her eyes, wide with apprehension, darted toward the door as if longing for escape. Miss Jane Marple, having returned to the drawing-room after her discreet eavesdropping, had managed to secure a vantage point near the library's entrance once more. She sat in a cushioned chair, just outside, her knitting bag open beside her, the pale blue wool spilling across her lap. To any passer-by, she was merely an elderly guest, perhaps waiting for a friend, but her ears were attuned to the voices within, and her mind was as sharp as ever. She had seen girls like Ellen in St. Mary Mead, burdened by circumstance, their lives shaped by duties and debts. Such girls, she knew, could be driven to desperate acts, but they could also be pawns in larger games. Inside the library, Inspector Grayson's voice was firm but not unkind. "Miss Carter, you were in the dining hall all evening, serving. You had access to the Tiara's case. Tell me what you saw." His pencil hovered over his notebook, ready to capture every word. Ellen's voice was barely above a whisper. "I didn't see nothing, sir. I was clearing plates, like always. The guests were eating, talking. I kept my head down." Her words came in a rush, as if rehearsed, and Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her tone, the way her hands clutched her apron like a lifeline. Grayson leaned forward, his gray eyes narrowing. "You were near the dais, girl. One of the footmen saw you pause by the case during the dessert course, just before Lady Harwood screamed. What were you doing there?" Ellen's cheeks flushed, and she shook her head vehemently. "I was only straightening a napkin on my tray, sir. I didn't touch the case, I swear." Her voice cracked, and she bit her lip, her eyes filling with tears. "I know my place. I'd never do something so wicked." Miss Marple's needles slowed her, mind turning over the girl's words. Ellen's denial was fervent, but fear could mask both guilt and innocence. In her village, Miss Marple had known a housemaid who stole a silver spoon to pay for her mother's medicine, only to confess in tears when confronted with kindness. Ellen's distress was similar, but there was something more, a flicker of dread that went beyond the fear of accusation. Was she afraid of the thief, or of something else entirely? Grayson pressed on, his tone sharpening. You live in the village, don't you? With your family? Word is, your father's been ill, and there's debts piling up. A tiara like that could solve a lot of problems, couldn't it? Ellen's eyes widened, and she took a step back, her hands flying to her mouth. No, sir. I'd never. My family's honest, even if we're poor. I work hard, I do, to help them. Please, you must believe me. Her voice broke, and a single tear escaped, tracing a path down her cheek. Miss Marple, listening intently, felt a pang of sympathy. She rose quietly, her knitting tucked away, and approached the library door, pretending to adjust her shawl. The butler, stationed nearby, gave her a polite nod, but did not question her presence. She knocked softly and peered inside. Oh, Inspector, forgive me, she said, her voice mild and apologetic. I couldn't help overhearing, and the poor girl looks quite overwrought. Might I have a word with her? Sometimes a woman's touch can calm the nerves. Grayson, clearly irritated by the interruption, hesitated but nodded curtly. Very well, Miss Marple, but make it quick. We've a crime to solve. He stepped aside, and Ellen, still trembling, followed Miss Marple to a small settee in the corner of the library, away from the desk's harsh light. Miss Marple sat beside her, her expression kind but her eyes keen. Now, my dear, she said softly, patting Ellen's hand, you've had a dreadful shock, haven't you? All this talk of theft and suspicion, it's enough to unsettle anyone. But you must tell the truth, you know. It's always better in the end. Her voice was gentle, almost maternal, and Ellen's shoulders sagged, as if the weight of her fear had momentarily lifted. I didn't take it, Miss Ellen whispered, her eyes fixed on her lap. I swear on my mother's grave, but I'm afraid they'll think I did. Everyone knows we're struggling, and I was near the case. But I only stopped to fix my tray. It was slipping, and I didn't want to drop it. Her words tumbled out, and Miss Marple listened, her face a mask of quiet encouragement. I believe you mean what you say, Ellen, she said, her tone soothing. But tell me, did you notice anything odd tonight? Anyone near the case who shouldn't have been, or perhaps something out of place? She kept her voice light, as if asking about the weather. But her eyes missed nothing. The way Ellen's fingers tightened, the way her gaze flickered toward the door. Ellen hesitated, then shook her head. I don't know, miss. It was so busy, with all the plates and the guests talking. I didn't see nothing, nobody, I mean. But her voice faltered, and Miss Marple caught the slight pause, the way her eyes darted away. The girl was holding something back, not out of malice, perhaps, but out of fear. Miss Marple leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. My dear, I've known girls like you, good girls, caught in difficult times. Sometimes they see things they're afraid to mention, for fear of trouble. But keeping silent can make things worse. If you saw something, even something small, it could help. Ellen's lips trembled, and for a moment, it seemed she might speak. But then she shook her head again, more firmly this time. I didn't see anything, miss. I was just doing my work. Her voice was steadier now, but Miss Marple sensed the effort behind it. She did not press further, knowing that fear could not be forced away. Instead, she patted Ellen's hand again and stood, her smile warm but her mind alert. Thank you, my dear. You rest now. The inspector will sort this out, I'm sure. She returned to her chair outside, her knitting resumed, but her thoughts were racing. Ellen's fear was genuine, but it was not just a fear of being accused. She knew something, or suspected it, and that knowledge was a burden she could not yet share. Miss Marple recalled a girl in St. Mary Mead who had witnessed a theft but stayed silent to protect a loved one. Ellen's family, with their debts and her father's illness, might be such a vulnerability. Back in the library, Grayson resumed his questioning, but Ellen's answers remained the same, brief, nervous, and unhelpful. He dismissed her with a sigh, turning to his sergeant. "She's hiding something, Brooks, but I'll be damned if I can get it out of her. We'll need to check her quarters, and soon." Miss Marple, overhearing, made a mental note. A search might reveal nothing, or it might confirm her suspicions. Ellen's access to the dining hall, her knowledge of the palace's routines, made her a plausible suspect, but Miss Marple sensed she was not the mastermind. A girl like Ellen acted out of desperation, not calculation. As Ellen returned to the drawing room, her face still pale, Miss Marple observed the other suspects. Monsieur Villette was engaged in a low conversation with Lord Harwood, his charm undiminished, despite the scrutiny. Antonio Rossi had retreated to the kitchen, his absence noted by the guests' complaints about cold tea. Lady Beatrice Langley sat fanning herself, her expression one of bored indignation, as if the entire affair were beneath her. Each, Miss Marple thought, had their own secrets, but Ellen's burden was the heaviest, or so it seemed. She considered the Tiara's disappearance anew. The lock's lack of damage suggested a key, and Ellen, as a maid, might have access to the servants' passages, which could lead to the study where the key was kept. But would a girl so nervous, so visibly distressed, have the nerve to execute such a theft? Or was she, perhaps, a distraction, her fear drawing attention, while another moved in the shadows? Miss Marple's needles clicked faster, her mind turning over the possibilities. In her village, she had seen how fear could be manipulated, how the guilty could hide behind the innocent. Ellen is a piece of the puzzle, she thought, but not the whole picture. As the night deepened, the guests began to retire, their movements watched by Grayson's men. Miss Marple remained, her knitting a steady rhythm, her eyes missing nothing. Ellen's burden would reveal itself in time, she was certain. For now, she would watch and listen, as she always did. The truth, she knew, lay in the small things, the glance, the pause, the trembling hand. And in Harwood Palace, as in St. Mary Mead, those small things would lead her to the heart of the mystery. Chapter 5. The chefs tempered the kitchens of Harwood Palace were a world apart from the polished elegance of the dining hall. A bustling domain of steam and clatter where the air was thick with the scents of roasted herbs, baking bread, and the faint tang of lemon from the evening soufflés. Copper pots hung in gleaming rows, and the long oak table at the center bore the scars of countless preparations. It was here, amid the controlled chaos, that Antonio Rossi, the chef, held court, his broad frame moving with a surprising grace as he barked orders to his underlings. But tonight, the rhythm of the kitchen was disrupted. The staff subdued under the weight of the Tiara's theft and the police presence that had followed. Miss Jane Marple, having excused herself from the drawing room with a murmured remark about needing air, made her way to the service corridor leading to the kitchens. Her knitting bag swung gently at her side, a familiar prop that rendered her presence unthreatening to the staff bustling past. She had a knack for slipping into places where she was not expected, her unassuming demeanor disarming even the most guarded. Her purpose now was to observe Rossi, whose volatile energy had caught her attention during the dinner. There was something about a man with a temper, she thought, that often betrayed more than he intended. The kitchen door swung open as a waiter emerged, and Miss Marple seized the moment to step inside, her eyes adjusting to the bright light and frenetic activity. Rossi stood at the far end, his white chef's coat stained with flour and sauce. His face flushed as he berated a young scullery maid for a poorly cleaned pan. "Imbecile. Do you think this is a tavern? Precision, always precision." His voice boomed, his Italian accent thickening with his agitation. The maid flinched, and Miss Marple noted the way the other staff kept their heads down. Accustomed to his outbursts, she approached quietly, pausing near a rack of spices, as if admiring the orderliness. Rossi's eyes flicked toward her, and his scowl softened into a forced smile. "Signora, you should not be here," he said, wiping his hands on a cloth. "The kitchen, it is no place for a guest." His tone was polite, but there was an edge to it, a wariness that Miss Marple recognized from years of observing human nature. "I do apologize, Mr. Rossi," she said, her voice mild and her smile disarming. "I was so taken with your soufflé tonight, such a delicate touch. I simply had to see where such artistry is created." Her flattery was calculated, and Rossi's chest puffed slightly, though his eyes remained guarded. "Grazie, signora, but it is only my work," he said, gesturing to the kitchen. "Now, with this nonsense about the tiara, everything is upside down. I have no time for thieves. I cook." He laughed, a loud, hollow sound, and Miss Marple noted the smudge of flour on his cuff, still present from earlier. It was an odd detail for a man so proud of his precision. A man who boasted of running a kitchen as tight as a ship. Inspector Grayson had not yet called Rossi for a formal interview, but Miss Marple knew he would soon. She had overheard the inspector instructing his sergeant to summon the chef next, and she intended to gather her own impressions first. "It must be dreadfully upsetting," she said, her tone sympathetic. "All this fuss, and you with such a busy evening. I suppose you were in the kitchen the whole time." Rossi's eyes narrowed slightly, but he nodded. "Sis, all evening. The soufflé, it cannot be left. Timing is everything. I stepped into the hall once, maybe twice, to check the service, but that is all." He waved a hand dismissively, but Miss Marple caught the slight hesitation, the way his fingers tightened on the cloth. She glanced around the kitchen, her eyes falling on a back door, slightly ajar, that led to a courtyard. It was a narrow exit, used for deliveries, and it caught her interest immediately. "Oh, what a charming door," she said, moving toward it as if curious. "Does it lead to a garden? I do love a bit of fresh air after a meal." Rossi's face tightened, and he moved quickly to block her path, his smile strained. No, signora, just the courtyard. For deliveries, you know. It is nothing to see." His haste was telling, and Miss Marple filed it away, her expression unchanged. "Of course," she said, stepping back. "I mustn't keep you from your work. Such a responsibility, feeding all these important people." She smiled again, and Rossi relaxed slightly, turning back to his staff with a renewed burst of orders. But Miss Marple's mind was already at work. The courtyard door was a potential escape route for the Tiara, one that Rossi, with his access to the kitchen, could easily have used. His temper, she thought, might be a cover for nerves or guilt. As she returned to the corridor, she encountered Inspector Grayson, who was making his way to the kitchen. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone a mix of surprise and mild exasperation, "you seem to be everywhere tonight." "Only trying to be helpful, Inspector," she replied, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. "I was just admiring Mr. Rossi's kitchen. Such a passionate man, don't you think? Though I wonder if he's always so particular about his cuffs." She gestured vaguely, as if the comment were an afterthought, but Grayson's eyes sharpened. "Cuffs, you say?" He made a note, then nodded. "I'm about to speak with him. Care to sit in, since you're so interested?" His tone was half sarcastic, but Miss Marple accepted with a gracious smile, following him back to the kitchen. Inside, Grayson called Rossi to a corner, where a small table served as a makeshift office. The chef sat heavily, his arms crossed, his face still flushed. "Inspector, this is a waste of time," he began, his voice loud. "I am a chef, not a thief. I was in my kitchen working. Ask anyone." Grayson, unfazed, opened his notebook. "Let's go over it, Mr. Rossi. You say you were in the kitchen all evening, but you stepped into the dining hall briefly, when you—" "Exactly." Rossi shrugged, his hands spreading wide. "During the fish course, Maybe, and again before the dessert. I check on my staff, make sure the plates are perfect. It is my job. His voice rose, and Miss Marple noted the way the scullery maid flinched again, her eyes fixed on the floor. In this courtyard door, Grayson said, glancing toward it. It's open. Anyone use it tonight? Rossi's eyes flicked to the door, then back to Grayson. No, no one. It's for deliveries, and we had none tonight. Maybe it was left open by mistake. His tone was casual, but Miss Marple caught the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers drummed on the table. Grayson made another note. We'll check it. And we've had word you've been seen in the village, arguing with a pawnbroker. Care to explain? Rossi's face darkened, and he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a growl. That is private, Inspector. A disagreement over a bill, nothing more. You think I steal a tiara to pawn it? Ridicolo? He slammed a hand on the table, and the scullery maid dropped a spoon, the clatter echoing in the sudden silence. Miss Marple, seated quietly, spoke up, her voice soft but clear. Oh, Mr. Rossi, I'm sure the inspector doesn't mean to offend. It's only that a man of your talent must have many demands on his time and, perhaps, his purse. Kitchens are expensive to run, aren't they? Her tone was innocent, but her eyes were sharp, watching for his reaction. Rossi's glare softened, but only slightly. Expensive, but I manage. I don't need to steal. He stood, brushing his hands on his coat. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a kitchen to run. Grayson dismissed him, but signaled to his sergeant to check the courtyard door. Miss Marple, rising to leave, paused by the door herself, her fingers brushing the handle. It was cold, recently used, and the latch was loose, as if it had been opened and closed frequently. A convenient exit, she thought, her mind returning to the unlatched window in the service corridor. The pieces were beginning to connect, but the picture was still unclear. Back in the drawing room, she resumed her knitting, her eyes drifting to Rossi as he re-entered, his temper barely contained as he snapped at a waiter. His passion for his work was genuine, but passion, she knew, could mask other motives. A man with debts, a temper, and access to an unguarded door was a dangerous combination. In St. Mary Mead, she had known a baker who pilfered from his own shop to settle gambling debts, his outbursts a shield for his guilt. Rossi, she thought, might be cut from similar cloth. As the night grew late, Miss Marple's needles clicked, steadily, her thoughts weaving a pattern as intricate as her wool. Rossi's temper was a clue, but not the whole story. She would need to watch him, and the others, closely. The tiara, she was certain, was still within the palace, and the truth was waiting to be uncovered, one stitch at a time. Chapter 6. The Noble's Pride. The drawing room of Harwood Palace, though still aglow with the soft light of its chandeliers, had grown oppressive as the night wore on. The fire in the hearth had dwindled to embers, and the guests, their nerves frayed by the tiara's theft and Inspector Grayson's relentless questioning, spoke in hushed tones, or not at all. Lady Beatrice Langley, seated in a velvet-upholstered armchair near a window, held court in her own way, her posture rigid and her fan moving with sharp, deliberate snaps. Her emerald necklace and diamond earrings caught the light, a silent proclamation of her status, but her expression was one of barely concealed indignation, as if the very act of suspicion were an affront to her lineage. Miss Jane Marple, ensconced in her usual corner with her knitting, observed Lady Beatrice with a quiet intensity. The noble's haughty demeanor was not unfamiliar to her. In St. Mary Mead, she had encountered women of similar pride, their airs masking vulnerabilities that only a keen eye could detect. Lady Beatrice's open admiration of the tiara during dinner, coupled with her brief absence to the powder room, had piqued Miss Marple's interest. Pride, she knew, could drive a person to desperate acts, especially when paired with need, and village gossip, overheard during her stay. suggested that Lady Beatrice's wealth was not as secure as her demeanor implied. Inspector Grayson, having concluded his interview with Antonio Rossi, now called for Lady Beatrice to join him in the library. She rose with a rustle of silk, her chin lifted as if preparing for battle. "This is preposterous," she declared to no one in particular, her voice carrying across the room. "To be treated like a common criminal in a house such as this." She swept toward the library, her fan snapping shut, and Miss Marple, with a murmured excuse about fetching her shawl, followed at a discreet distance. She settled into her alcove outside the library, her knitting needles clicking softly, her ears attuned to the conversation within. Inside, Grayson stood by the desk, his notebook open and his expression impassive. "Lady Beatrice, thank you for coming," he began, his tone polite but firm. "I'll keep this brief. You were seated near the Tiara's case tonight, and you were heard commenting on its beauty. Care to tell me your movements during the dinner?" Lady Beatrice's lips curled into a thin smile, her eyes cold. "Inspector, I am a guest of Lord Harwood, not some pickpocket to be interrogated. I sat at the table, I dined, I conversed. I admired the tiara, as any person of taste would. It is a magnificent piece, far superior to anything in my own collection." Her voice dripped with disdain, but Miss Marple caught the slight emphasis, "on my own collection," as if it were a point of pride or a sore spot. Grayson, undeterred, pressed on. "You left the table during the dessert course, did you not? To the powder room, you said. How long were you gone?" Lady Beatrice's fan opened with a snap, and she waved it slowly, her eyes narrowing. "A few minutes, no more. A lady requires a moment to refresh herself, Inspector. Surely you don't suspect me of crawling about stealing jewels in the interim." Her tone was mocking, but Miss Marple noted the way her free hand rested on her necklace, fingers brushing the emeralds, as if to reassure herself of their presence. "Those few minutes," Grayson said, his voice steady, coincide with the tiara's disappearance. "The powder room is near the service corridor, which leads to the dais. Did you see anyone there, or anything unusual?" Lady Beatrice's laugh was sharp, almost brittle. "I saw nothing but my own reflection, Inspector. The corridor was empty, the house in order. I returned to my seat, and shortly after, Lady Harwood raised the alarm. That is all." Her words were clipped, her posture stiff, and Miss Marple, listening intently, sensed a practiced quality to her response. A woman of Lady Beatrice's station would be skilled at deflection, but her pride could betray her in subtler ways. Grayson made a note, his pencil scratching softly. "Your finances, Lady Beatrice? There's talk in the village gambling debts, losses at the races. A tiara like that could fetch a tidy sum." The fan stopped mid-wave, and Lady Beatrice's face hardened, her eyes flashing with fury. "How dare you?" she snapped, rising from her chair. "My financial affairs are none of your concern, Inspector. The Langleys have wealth enough, and I have no need to stoop to theft. This is an outrage." Her voice trembled with indignation, but Miss Marple caught the faint flush creeping up her neck, a sign of discomfort that belied her protestations. Grayson remained calm, his eyes fixed on her. "Sit down, my lady. I'm only doing my job. If you've nothing to hide, you won't mind us checking your rooms, will you?" Lady Beatrice's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment it seemed she might refuse. Then, with a toss of her head, she sat, her fan resuming its sharp movements. "Search if you must, Inspector. You'll find nothing but gowns and jewels that are rightfully mine. This is a waste of time." Her tone was icy, but Miss Marple noted the way her fingers tightened on the fan, the knuckles whitening. The interview concluded, and Lady Beatrice swept out of the library, her silk gown rustling like a storm. Miss Marple, her knitting paused, watched her return to the drawing room, where she resumed her seat with an air of affronted dignity. The other guests avoided her gaze, and even Lord Harwood, usually attentive to his high-ranking guests, gave her a wide berth. Miss Marple's mind turned over the exchange. Lady Beatrice's pride was her armor, but armor could conceal cracks. The gambling debts, mentioned so casually by Grayson, were a clue worth pursuing. In St. Mary Mead, she had known a squire's wife who sold family heirlooms to cover her losses at cards, her pride masking her shame until the truth came out. Miss Marple rose, her knitting tucked away, and approached Lady Harwood, who was attempting to soothe the remaining guests with offers of tea. "My dear," Miss Marple said softly, "Lady Beatrice seems quite upset. Has she been under strain recently? One hears such things in the village, you know." Her tone was gentle, as if sharing idle gossip, but her eyes were sharp. Lady Harwood hesitated, then sighed. "Oh, Jane, you do hear everything, don't you? Beatrice has been indiscreet at the races, I'm afraid. She's lost more than she can easily afford, though she'd never admit it. But surely you don't think—" She broke off, her hand fluttering to her throat. Ms. Marple smiled reassuringly. "I think nothing, my dear. I only wonder how such pressures weigh on a person." She patted Lady Harwood's arm and returned to her seat, her mind alive with possibilities. Lady Beatrice's absence during the dessert course, though brief, was perfectly timed. The powder room's proximity to the service corridor, and thus to the dais, offered opportunity. But would a woman of her status risk such a brazen act? Or was her pride a mask for something more calculated? As the guests began to retire, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes drifting to Lady Beatrice, who sat alone, her fan now still. The noble's face was composed, but her eyes were distant, as if lost in thought or calculation. Miss Marple recalled a case in her village, where a proud widow had orchestrated a theft to preserve her standing, using a servant as a scapegoat. Lady Beatrice, with her wealth and status, might not need the tiara's value, but her pride might drive her to possess it, or to prove she could. The night grew quiet, the palace settling into an uneasy calm. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her thoughts weaving a pattern as intricate as her wool. Lady Beatrice's pride was a thread in the mystery, but whether it led to guilt or merely distraction, she could not yet say. She would watch, as always, for the small things, the glance, the gesture, the unspoken truth. In Harwood Palace, as in St. Mary Mead, those truths would surface, given time. Chapter 7. The Palace's Secrets. The morning after the theft dawned gray and heavy over Harwood Palace, the mist clinging to the manicured lawns and shrouding the stone turrets in a veil of secrecy. Inside, the grandeur of the previous evening had faded, replaced by an air of unease that permeated even the servants' quarters. The guests, confined to the palace by Inspector Grayson's orders, moved with restless caution, their conversations hushed and their glances sharp. The tiara's absence was a wound to the household's pride, and the search for answers had only deepened the suspicion that hung over all. Miss Jane Marple, having risen early despite the late night, sat in her guest room overlooking the gardens, her knitting idle for once. Her window was slightly ajar, admitting the damp air and the faint sound of a gardener's rake. She had requested a tour of the palace from Lady Harwood, ostensibly to admire its architecture and history, but her true purpose was to map its corridors and corners, to uncover the hidden pathways that might reveal the tiara's fate. Her years in St. Mary Mead had taught her that a house, like a person, held secrets in its structured doors unnoticed, windows unlatched, rooms overlooked by those too busy to see. Lady Harwood, ever gracious despite her strain, agreed to the tour, assigning a young footman named Thomas to guide Miss Marple. Thomas, the same waiter who had hesitated during Grayson's questioning, was a lanky lad with a nervous manner, his eyes darting as he led her through the palace's labyrinthine halls. Miss Marple, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, and her knitting bag in hand, chatted amiably about the palace's history, her questions light but pointed. "Such a grand place," she said, pausing before a tapestry of a medieval hunt. I suppose the staff know every nook and cranny, don't they? It must be easy to move about unseen. Thomas flushed, his hands fidgeting with his cuffs. Oh yes, ma'am. The servants' passages are handy for getting around quick-like, without bothering the guests. His voice was eager to please, but Miss Marple noted the way his eyes avoided hers, as if he feared saying too much. She smiled encouragingly, filing the detail away. Their tour began in the dining hall, now empty save for a maid sweeping the marble floor. The Tiara's case stood forlorn on its dais, the glass gleaming under the morning light. Miss Marple lingered, her eyes tracing the case's edges. The lock, as Grayson had noted, was untouched, but she noticed a faint scratch on the brass frame, so slight it might have been overlooked. A key, perhaps, she murmured, too softly for Thomas to hear. The scratch suggested carelessness, or haste, and she wondered whose hand had held the tool. From the dining hall, Thomas led her to the service corridor, a narrow passage lined with faded wallpaper and lit by small, high windows. It connected the dining hall to the kitchens and beyond, a route used by staff to move unseen. Miss Marple paused at one window, its latch loose and its frame slightly warped. Oh, what a quaint little window, she said, reaching up to touch the sill. Does it open often? For air, perhaps? The sill was clean, free of the dust that gathered in neglected places, and the latch moved easily under her fingers. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. Not often, ma'am. It's mostly for ventilation, but it's been chilly lately, so I reckon it stayed shut. His words were quick, and Miss Marple noted the slight quiver in his voice. The window, too small for a person but large enough for a tiara, overlooked the courtyard she had seen from the kitchen. A possible escape route, she thought, though it would require a Confederate outside or a hiding place nearby. The tour continued through the servants' quarters, a warren of small rooms and steep staircases. Miss Marple asked about the staff's routines, her tone casual, but her questions precise. Do the maids ever work alone in the dining hall? She asked, pausing by a linen closet. Thomas hesitated, then nodded. Sometimes, ma'am, for cleaning or setting up. Ellen Miss Carter's, she's often there early, laying out the silver. His mention of Ellen was reluctant, and Miss Marple made a mental note. Ellen's access, combined with her fear, made her a figure of interest, though not necessarily of guilt. They passed the study where Lord Harwood kept the Tiara's key, a heavy oak door with a polished brass lock. Oh, is this Lord Harwood's study? Miss Marple asked, her voice bright with curiosity. Such a fine door. I suppose it's kept locked. Thomas nodded, his eyes flicking to the keyhole. Always, ma'am. Only his lordship and the butler have keys. Miss Marple smiled, but her mind was racing. A locked study was no barrier to someone with access or cunning, and the proximity to the antechamber where Villette had taken his call was troubling. The tour ended in the courtyard, a cobblestone space bordered by low shrubs and a wrought-iron gate. The kitchen door, slightly ajar, as Miss Marple had noted the previous night, stood at one end, and the window from the service corridor overlooked the other. She wandered to the gate, her fingers brushing the iron. Such a charming spot, she said, though her eyes scanned the ground for signs of disturbance. A faint scuff in the dirt, barely visible, caught her attention. It could have been a gardener's boot, or something else entirely. Does anyone come out here at night? She asked, her tone idle. Thomas shook his head quickly. Not usually, ma'am. It's for deliveries, mostly, or the staff, taking a break, but not during a dinner like last night. His haste to dismiss the courtyard's significance was telling, and Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. She thanked him warmly, letting him return to his duties, and lingered a moment longer, her eyes on the window above. The tiara, she thought, could have been passed through that window, hidden in the courtyard, or spirited away through the gate. But by whom? Back in her room, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting resumed, but her thoughts elsewhere. The palace was a maze of possibilities, its secrets hidden in plain sight. The unlatched window, the scratched lock, the scuffed dirt hall, were clues, small but significant. In St. Mary Mead, she had solved a theft by noticing a misplaced rug that hid a trapdoor. Here, the palace's secrets were larger, but the principle was the same. Look where others did not. She considered the suspects anew. Ellen's access to the corridors made her a candidate, but her fear suggested she was not the mastermind. Villette's phone call in proximity to the study pointed to opportunity, but his diplomatic status complicated matters. Rossi's kitchen. Torn temper hinted at impulsiveness, but he lacked subtlety. Lady Beatrice's pride and brief absence were suspicious, but her motives were less clear. The palace itself, with its hidden passages and unguarded exits, was almost a fifth suspect, enabling the crime as much as any person. As the morning wore on, Miss Marple prepared to join the others for breakfast, her mind weaving a pattern from the threads she had gathered. The tiara was still within the palace, she felt certain, its size making an immediate escape unlikely. The thief, or thieves, had planned carefully, exploiting the palace's secrets. But secrets, she knew, had a way of unraveling, especially when observed by someone who understood the ways of human nature. With a quiet smile, she tucked her knitting away and descended the stairs, ready to watch and listen for the next piece of the puzzle. Chapter 8. A village connection. The village of St. Mary Mead, nestled a short distance from Harwood Palace, was a quaint cluster of thatched cottages and cobblestone lanes, its rhythms as familiar to Miss Jane Marple as the stitches in her knitting. The morning mist had lifted, revealing a sky of pale blue, and the air carried the scent of freshly baked bread from the local bakery. Miss Marple, having secured Lord Harwood's permission to visit the village under the pretense of collecting a parcel from her nephew Raymond, set out in a hired car, her knitting bag at her side and her mind sharp with purpose. The palace's secrets had begun to reveal themselves, but she knew the village, with its gossip and hidden truths, held clues that could illuminate the tiara's theft. Her destination was the shop of Mr. Higgs, the local pawnbroker, whose establishment sat at the edge of the village square, its faded sign creaking in the breeze. Miss Marple had learned from a passing remark by a palace maid that Higgs was known to deal in more than just trinkets. His backroom transactions whispered about in hushed tones. If the tiara had been spirited away, or if any of the suspects sought to profit from it, Higgs was a likely contact. She entered the shop, the bell above the door jingling softly, and adopted the air of a curious spinster browsing for a keepsake. The shop was dim, its shelves cluttered with tarnished silver, chipped porcelain, and faded jewelry. Mr. Higgs, a wiry man with a pinched face and spectacles perched on his nose, looked up from his ledger. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, his voice oily but cautious. "Looking for something special?" His eyes flicked over her, assessing her shawl and sensible shoes, clearly unsure whether she was a serious customer or a med. Miss Marple smiled, her expression disarming. "Oh, just browsing, Mr. Higgs. I'm staying at the palace, you know, and I thought I might find a little something for my nephew's wife. But such a dreadful business up there, isn't it? The tiara stolen, and everyone in a tizzy." Her tone was light, almost gossipy, but her eyes were keen. Watching his reaction, Higgs's fingers tightened on his pen, and his smile faltered. I heard about that. A bad business, right enough. But I don't know nothing about it, ma'am. My trade's honest." His words were quick, and Miss Marple noted the way his gaze darted to a curtained doorway at the back of the shop. Of course, she said, picking up a tarnished brooch and examining it closely. "But in a village like this, word travels fast. I heard poor Ellen Carter's brother was in here recently, trying to sell a locket. Such a sad case. Their family, with all those debts. She sighed, her voice sympathetic, but her eyes never left Higgs. The pawnbroker's face tightened, and he adjusted his spectacles. Young Tom Carter? Halle. He brought in a locket, said it was his mother's, to help with the bills. I gave him a fair price, nothing more. Folks in trouble come to me, but I don't ask questions. His tone was defensive, and Miss Marple caught the slight tremor in his hands. Ellen's brother, she thought, was a link to the maid's desperation, and Higgs's involvement suggested he knew more than he let on. She set the brooch down and leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. And Mr. Rossi, the chef at the palace, such a temper, I hear. Someone mentioned seeing him arguing with you in the square last week. I do hope it wasn't anything serious. Her words were casual, but her gaze was sharp, watching for the crack in his composure. Higgs's eyes narrowed, and he busied himself with his ledger, his fingers fumbling. Rossi? He's a loud one. Sure enough, we had words over a delivery bill, nothing to do with jewels. He's got debts, like half the village, but that's no concern of mine. His denial was too quick, and Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. In St. Mary Mead, she had known a shopkeeper who dealt in stolen goods. His denials as practiced as Higgs's. A man like that thrived on secrets, and Rossi's argument suggested a connection worth exploring. Before she could press further, the bell jingled again, and a man in a dark coat entered, his hat pulled low. Higgs's face paled, and he excused himself, hurrying to the back room with the stranger. Miss Marple, pretending to examine a cracked teacup, overheard a murmured exchange, something about waiting for the right buyer and keeping it quiet. The words were vague, but they set her mind racing. She recalled the footman's mention of Monsieur Villette meeting a man in a dark coat near the village post office. Could this be the same man? And was Higgs the link between the palace and the outside world? She left the shop with a polite nod, promising to return, and strolled to the village tea shop, where gossip flowed as freely as the tea. Settling at a corner table with a pot of Earl Grey, she struck up a conversation with Mrs. Phipps, the proprietress, whose tongue was as sharp as her scones were fresh. Such a to-do at the palace, Miss Marple said, buttering a scone. And that poor maid, Ellen Carter, her family's in such straits, I hear. Mrs. Phipps leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with the joy of sharing news. Oh, Miss Marple, it's a sad case. Ellen's father's been ill for months, and the debts keep piling up. Her brother Tom's been trying to help, but he's not got much sense. Word is he's been to Higgs, selling what little they have left. She lowered her voice. And Rossi, that chef, lewd as a thunderstorm. He is. Saw him shouting at Higgs in the square, something about money owed. Not surprised, mind you. Rossi's been flashing cash he shouldn't have, if you ask me. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of mild concern. And the diplomat, Monsieur Villette, I suppose he's too grand for village matters. She sipped her tea, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. Mrs. Phipps sniffed. Grand, maybe. But he was here yesterday, meeting some fellow by the post office. Shady looking, in a dark coat. Looked like they didn't want to be seen, if you know what I mean. She bustled off to serve another customer, leaving Miss Marple to her thoughts. The village, she realized, was a mirror to the palace, its gossip reflecting the tensions within. Ellen's brother Rossi's argument, Villette's mysterious meeting, all pointed to a web of connections, with Higgs at its center. The tiara, too valuable to pawn openly, might be hidden, waiting for a discreet buyer. Or perhaps it was still in the palace, its theft a distraction for another purpose. Miss Marple recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a stolen brooch was found in a pawn shop, the thief betrayed by his own boasting. Higgs, she thought, was not so careless. But his nervousness suggested he knew more than he admitted. Returning to the palace, Miss Marple sat in the garden, her knitting resumed but her mind elsewhere. The village had given her threads to follow. Ellen's desperation, Rossi's debts, Villett's secrecy. Each suspect was tied to the village, and thus to Higgs. The pawnbroker was a key, but not the lock. The Tiara's fate, she felt certain, lay in the interplay of these motives, hidden in the palace's corridors or the village's whispers. With a quiet smile, she tucked her knitting away, ready to watch for the next clue in this intricate dance of deception. Chapter 9. The trap is set. The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of Harwood Palace's drawing room, casting long shadows across the polished floorboards and lending a deceptive calm to the strained atmosphere. The guests, still confined by Inspector Grayson's orders, moved restlessly, their conversations stilted and their eyes wary. The theft of the royal tiara hung over them like a storm cloud, and the weight of suspicion had begun to fray even the most polished facades. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her accustomed corner with her knitting, observed the scene with her usual quiet intensity. Her needles moved steadily, but her mind was far from the pale blue wool in her lap, weaving instead a plan to unravel the mystery. Her visit to St. Mary Mead had confirmed her suspicions. The village held threads that connected to the palace, and the pawnbroker, Mr. Higgs, was a knot in that web. Ellen Carter's family debts, Antonio Rossi's heated argument, and Monsieur Villette's clandestine meeting all pointed to motives and opportunities. But the tiara's whereabouts remained elusive. Miss Marple knew that the truth often surfaced when the guilty were pressed, and a subtle push could reveal more than hours of questioning. She needed a way to stir the waters without alerting the thief. As the guests gathered for a late luncheon, Miss Marple approached Inspector Grayson, who was reviewing his notes in a corner of the dining hall. His face was etched with frustration, the lack of progress wearing on him. "Inspector," she said, her voice soft and deferential, "I wonder if I might make a suggestion. In my village, we once caught a thief by letting it be known that a clue had been found, a small thing, but enough to make the culprit nervous. Perhaps something similar might work here." Grayson raised an eyebrow, his skepticism tempered by a grudging respect for the elderly lady, who seemed to see more than his own men. "A trap, you mean? What kind of clue?" His pencil hovered, ready to dismiss her, but Miss Marple's calm certainty held his attention. "Oh, something simple," she replied, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. "Perhaps a piece of fabric caught in the courtyard gate, suggesting the tiara was taken that way. Announce it to the household, and watch how they react. The guilty often betray themselves when they think they're discovered." Her tone was mild, as if suggesting a recipe for tea, but her words carried weight. Grayson considered, then nodded slowly. "It's worth a try. We've precious little else to go on." He called his Sergeant Brooks, and instructed him to prepare for a gathering in the drawing room. Miss Marple returned to her seat, her knitting resumed, but her attention was fixed on the suspects: Villette, with his polished charm; Ellen, pale and nervous; Rossi, pacing near the door; and Lady Beatrice, her fan snapping with irritation. The announcement was made after luncheon, as the guests and staff assembled in the drawing room. Grayson stood before the fireplace, his posture authoritative despite his evident fatigue. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying over the murmurs, "we've made a discovery in our investigation. A piece of fabric was found, caught in the courtyard gate, suggesting the tiara may have been taken that way. We're analyzing it now, and I assure you, we'll find the thief soon." His words were measured, but their impact was immediate. Miss Marple's eyes moved from face to face, noting each reaction. Ellen Carter, standing near the service table, went pale, her hands clutching her apron so tightly her knuckles whitened. Villette's smile tightened, his fingers pausing on the stem of his wineglass. Rossi, leaning against the wall, shifted his weight, his eyes darting to the door. Lady Beatrice's fan stopped mid-snap, her lips parting slightly before she recovered, her expression settling into one of disdain. "Fabric?" she said loudly. "What nonsense! You'll find nothing of mine out there." Her voice was sharp, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of unease in her eyes. The room buzzed with whispers, but Miss Marple's attention was drawn to Ellen, who excused herself with a mumbled apology and slipped toward the service corridor. Sensing an opportunity, Miss Marple rose, her knitting tucked away, and followed at a discreet distance. Her steps light on the polished floor. The corridor was dim, its high windows casting faint light, and Ellen's figure was a shadow moving quickly toward the courtyard door. Miss Marple paused, her hand on the wall, watching as the maid stepped outside in the courtyard. Ellen moved with frantic purpose, her eyes scanning the shrubs near the gate. She knelt, her hands brushing the dirt, and retrieved a small cloth bundle hidden behind a low bush. Her fingers trembled as she unwrapped it, only to find it empty. A soft gasp escaped her, and she clutched the cloth to her chest, her face crumpling. Miss Marple, hidden by the door's shadow, watched silently. The bundle's emptiness was a clue in itself. Someone had taken its contents. But who? Ellen stood, shoving the cloth into her apron pocket, and hurried back inside, unaware of Miss Marple's presence. The older woman lingered, her mind racing. The courtyard was a key link, its gate, and the unlatched window in the corridor, suggesting a planned escape. Ellen's actions confirmed her involvement, but the empty bundle hinted at another handsome one who had anticipated her move. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had once solved a theft by noticing a gardener's nervousness when a hidden parcel was mentioned. Ellen's fear was similar, but her role, Miss Marple thought, was that of a pawn, not a mastermind. Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her eyes drifting to the other suspects. Villette was now engaged in a quiet conversation with Lord Harwood, his charm undimmed, but his glances frequent toward the corridor. Rossi had retreated to the kitchen, his absence noted by a waiter's complaint. Lady Beatrice sat fanning herself, her expression one of forced calm. Each, Miss Marple thought, had reacted to the trap, but Ellen's flight to the courtyard was the most telling. She considered the possibilities. Ellen's desperation, tied to her family's debts, made her a likely candidate to steal the tiara, but her panic suggested she had not kept it. Villette's tightened smile hinted at knowledge, perhaps gained through his village connections. Rossi's restlessness and Lady Beatrice's unease were less clear, but no less significant. The trap had stirred the waters, and Miss Marple knew the ripples would lead her closer to the truth. For now, she would wait, her needles clicking steadily, her mind as sharp as the palace's secrets. Chapter 10. The Confession. The servants' quarters of Harwood Palace were a stark contrast to the grandeur of its public rooms, a maze of narrow corridors and small, sparsely furnished chambers, tucked beneath the eaves. The air was heavy with the scent of damp stone and starched linen, and the faint creak of floorboards echoed as Miss Jane Marple made her way to Ellen Carter's room. The trap she had suggested to Inspector Grayson had borne fruit. Ellen's frantic search in the courtyard had revealed her involvement, but the empty cloth bundles suggested a deeper complexity to the theft. Miss Marple, her knitting bag in hand, and her expression one of gentle concern, knew that a quiet word with the maid might loosen the threads of the mystery. Ellen's room was at the end of a dim hallway, its door slightly ajar. Miss Marple knocked, softly, her voice warm but firm. "Ellen, my dear, may I come in? I think we need to have a little chat." The door opened to reveal Ellen, her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed, the cloth bundle still clutched in her apron pocket. She hesitated, then stepped aside, her shoulders slumped as if the weight of her secret had become too much to bear. The room was small, with a single bed, a chipped washstand, and a narrow window overlooking the courtyard. Miss Marple sat on the edge of the bed, her knitting bag at her side, and gestured for Ellen to join her. "Now, my dear," she began, her tone as soothing as a village vicar's. "You've been carrying a heavy burden, haven't you? I saw you in the courtyard, looking for something that wasn't there. It's time to tell the truth. It will be easier, I promise." Ellen's lips trembled, and her hands twisted the cloth bundle, her knuckles white. "Oh, miss, I didn't mean for it to go so far," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I took the tiara, I did, but I swear I didn't want to keep it forever. It was for my family, my father's so ill, and the debts. We're losing everything." Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she buried her face in her hands, the bundle falling to the floor. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes kind but searching. "Go on, Ellen, tell me everything. How did you take it, and what happened to it?" Her voice was gentle, but there was a firmness beneath it, a quiet insistence that brooked no evasion. Ellen took a shuddering breath, her words tumbling out in a rush. It was during the dessert course. The dining hall was so busy, with everyone talking and the waiters moving about. I knew where his lordship kept the key, in the study, on a hook by the desk. I'd seen it when I was cleaning. I slipped into the study earlier that day, took the key, and hid it in my apron. When I was clearing plates near the dais, I unlocked the case. It was so quick, miss. Nobody saw. I wrapped the tiara in a cloth and hid it in the courtyard, behind the shrubs, meaning to get it later, after the fuss died down. Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged, but her mind racing. Ellen's story was plausible. Her access as a maid gave her the opportunity, and her desperation provided the motive. But the empty bundle was the key. "And then what happened, my dear?" "You went back for it today, but it was gone." Ellen's eyes widened, fresh tears welling. "Yes, miss, I hid it so careful, but when I checked this morning, after the inspector said about the fabric, it was just the cloth, nothing else. Someone took it, I swear. I don't know who, but I didn't sell it or nothing. I was going to take it to Mr. Higgs, just to pawn it for a bit, to pay the doctor. I was going to bring it back, I promise." Her voice rose, a mix of fear and despair, and Miss Marple patted her hand, her touch calming. "I believe you didn't mean to keep it, Ellen," she said softly. "But who else knew you took it? Did you tell anyone? Your brother, perhaps, or someone in the village?" Her question was gentle, but her eyes were sharp, watching for any flicker of recognition. Ellen shook her head vehemently. "No, miss. I told no one, not even Tom. I was too ashamed. I thought I could do it quiet-like, and nobody would know. But someone must have seen me, or found it somehow." Her voice faltered, and she looked at Miss Marple with pleading eyes. "You won't tell the inspector, will you? They'll lock me up, and my family'll be ruined." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, but her expression remained kind. "We must tell the truth, my dear, but I'll speak for you. You acted out of love for your family, and that counts for something." She paused, her mind turning over Ellen's words. The maid's confession confirmed her role, but the tiara's disappearance from the courtyard suggested a second player, someone who had watched, waited, and seized the opportunity. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had once uncovered a theft where a servant's act of desperation was exploited by a cunning accomplice. Here, the pattern seemed to repeat. She rose, her knitting bag in hand. "Stay here, Ellen, and try to rest. I'll speak with the inspector, but you must promise to tell him everything when the time comes." Ellen nodded, her tears slowing, and Miss Marple left the room, her steps light but purposeful. In the corridor she paused, her thoughts racing. Ellen's access to the study key and her moment of chaos in the dining hall explained the theft, but the empty bundle pointed to another hand. Violet's phone call, Rossi's courtyard door, Lady Beatrice's absence, all were possibilities, but none fit perfectly. Someone had known Ellen's plan, or stumbled upon her hiding place. The courtyard, with its unlatched window and scuffed dirt, was the key, and Miss Marple resolved to revisit it with Grayson. As she descended to the drawing room, she considered the suspects anew. Ellen's confession was a breakthrough, but it was not the end. The tiara was still missing, and the true thief, the one who had taken it from Ellen, remained at large. Miss Marple's needles, tucked in her bag, seemed to itch for movement, but her mind was already stitching together the clues. The truth, she knew, was close, hidden in the small things she had yet to uncover. Chapter 11. The Hidden Player. The late afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of Harwood Palace, casting a golden glow over the drawing room where Miss Jane Marple sat, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm. The air was heavy with the unspoken tension of the tiara's theft, and the guests, though permitted to move about the palace, carried the weight of suspicion in their guarded glances. Ellen Carter's confession had been a pivotal thread in the mystery, but the empty cloth bundle in the courtyard pointed to a second-hand hidden player, who had seized the tiara from its hiding place. Miss Marple, her mind as sharp as the needles in her hands, knew that the truth lay in the interplay of motives and opportunities, and she was determined to unravel it. Ellen's tearful admission had confirmed her role as the initial thief, driven by desperation to save her family from ruin. But the tiara's disappearance from the courtyard suggested a calculating mind, someone who had watched her closely or anticipated her actions. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the other suspects. Monsieur Claude Villette, with his polished charm and mysterious phone call. Antonio Rossi, whose temper and access to the courtyard door made him a candidate. And Lady Beatrice Langley, whose pride masked potential desperation. Each had opportunity, but the key lay in who had known of Ellen's plan or stumbled upon her secret. Miss Marple rose from her chair, her knitting tucked into her bag, and made her way to the library, where Inspector Grayson was reviewing his notes with Sergeant Brooks. The room was quieter now, the fire reduced to glowing coals, and Grayson's face bore the strain of a case that refused to resolve. "Miss Marple," he said, looking up with a mix of exasperation and curiosity, "you've a habit of turning up where you're least expected. Got another suggestion for me?" She smiled, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. "Only a," thought Inspector. "The courtyard is the key, I believe. Ellen hid the tiara there, but someone took it. Perhaps a closer look at who had access or who was seen nearby might help." Her tone was mild, but her words carried a quiet urgency. Grayson nodded, his skepticism softened by her earlier success with the fabric trap. "We've searched the courtyard, but I'll have another go, and we're checking the staff's quarters, starting with Ela." He paused, then added, "She's been nervous as a cat since we spoke. You think she's telling the truth?" Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "I think she's told us what she knows, Inspector, but there's another hand at play, someone who knew where to look." She left it at that, knowing Grayson would pursue his own methods. But her mind was already tracing the threads back to the village. Her visit to St. Mary Mead had revealed Monsieur Villette's meeting with a man in a dark coat, a detail that gnawed at her. The pawnbroker, Mr. Higgs, had been cagey about his dealings, and his mention of waiting for the right buyer suggested a connection to the tiara's fate. Villette, with his diplomatic status and access to discreet channels, was a likely candidate to exploit Elon's act. His phone call during the dinner, timed suspiciously close to the theft, and his meeting in the village pointed to a man with secrets beyond his official duties. Miss Marple returned to the drawing room, her eyes scanning the remaining guests. Villette was absent, having excused himself to his room, but Rossi stood by the window, his hands fidgeting as he spoke to a footman. Lady Beatrice sat fanning herself, her expression one of forced calm, while Ellen was nowhere to be seen, likely confined to her quarters. Miss Marple considered Violette's movements. The antechamber where he took his call was near the study where the tiara's key was kept. A diplomat, trained in discretion, could have slipped into the study, taken the key, and passed it to. Eleanor learned of her plan through palace gossip. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a visiting scholar had used his charm to manipulate a servant into stealing a rare book, only to take it for himself. Villette, she thought, might be playing a similar game, using Ellen's desperation as a cover for his own ends. His meeting with the man in the dark coat suggested a buyer, perhaps one linked to Higgs. The tiara, too valuable to pawn openly, could be intended for a private collector, its sale funding some covert diplomatic deal. Miss Marple approached Lady Harwood, who was arranging flowers to distract herself from the tension. "My dear," she said softly, "I wonder if you've noticed Monsieur Villette's habits. He seems so busy, with his phone calls and such. Does he often step away during gatherings?" Her tone was casual, but her eyes were sharp. Lady Harwood frowned, her hands pausing on a rose. "Now that you mention it, Jane, he does take calls often. Last night, he was gone for a bit during the fish course, and I saw him speaking to one of the footmen afterward, Thomas, I think. But he's always so charming, I thought nothing of it." She sighed, her face weary. "This whole affair is dreadful." Miss Marple nodded, her mind latching on to the mention of Thomas. The nervous footman had hesitated during great questioning, and his knowledge of the servants' passages made him a potential link. Had Villette enlisted him to watch Ellen, or to retrieve the tiara from the courtyard? She made a mental note to speak with Thomas again, her instincts telling her he was a weak point in the chain. As evening approached, Miss Marple shared her theory with Grayson, careful to frame it as a suggestion. "Inspector, I wonder if you might search Monsieur Villette's luggage. A man of his position might hide something valuable, in a clever way perhaps, a false-bottomed case, as I've heard diplomats sometimes use." Her voice was gentle, but her eyes were firm, and Grayson, though skeptical, agreed to act. The search was conducted discreetly, with Villette summoned to the library, under the pretense of further questioning. Miss Marple, positioned in her alcove, overheard the commotion as Grayson's men opened Villette's briefcase. A hidden compartment, cleverly concealed, yielded the tiara, its diamonds glinting in the lamplight. Villette's face paled, his charm crumbling as he stammered about diplomatic immunity. "This is a mistake," he protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Grayson, his eyes hard, shook his head. "We've contacted your embassy, monsieur. They're not pleased, and they've waived your immunity. You'll answer for this." The tiara was secured, and Villette was escorted to a guarded room, his protests fading into silence. Miss Marple, her knitting resumed, felt a quiet satisfaction. Villette had exploited Ellen's theft, likely learning of her plan through Thomas, or palace gossip, and taken the tiara for his own ends. His village meeting and Higgs's cryptic words pointed to a buyer, but the details would emerge in time. For now, the tiara was safe, and the hidden player had been revealed. But Miss Marple's mind lingered on the small things: the footman, hesitation, the pawnbroker's fear. There were still threads to tie off, and she would see them through. Chapter 12. The Resolution. The morning sun bathed Harwood Palace in a soft, forgiving light, its rays glinting off the restored royal tiara, now safely returned to its glass case in the dining hall. The tension that had gripped the household for days had begun to dissipate, replaced by a cautious relief, though whispers of the scandal lingered among the guests and staff. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the drawing-room with her knitting, observed the scene with quiet satisfaction. Her pale blue wool grew steadily, but her mind was on the threads of the mystery now neatly tied. Each suspect's role clarified by the events of the past hours. Inspector Grayson, his notebook finally closed, stood by the fireplace, addressing the assembled guests and staff. His face, though weary, carried a note of triumph. "The tiara has been recovered," he announced, his voice steady. "Monsieur Villette is in custody, and Miss Ellen Carter has confessed to her part in the theft. The matter is resolved, thanks to diligent police work and, I must admit, a certain lady's keen insight." His eyes flicked toward Miss Marple, who smiled demurely, her needles clicking softly. The recovery of the tiara had unfolded swiftly after. Villette's briefcase revealed its hidden compartment. His protests of diplomatic immunity had crumbled when his embassy, humiliated by the scandal, waived his protections. Miss Marple had pieced together the final threads. Villette, alerted to Ellen's plan through palace gossip, or the nervous footman Thomas, had watched her hide the tiara in the courtyard. Seizing the opportunity, he retrieved it, intending to sell it to a contact met in the village, likely through the pawnbroker Higgs. His diplomatic status had emboldened him, but his overconfidence had been his undoing. Ellen Carter, pale but composed, stood at the back of the room, her hands no longer twisting her apron. Miss Marple had spoken on her behalf to Lord Harwood, emphasizing the girl's desperation and remorse. She acted out of love for her family, my lord, Miss Marple had said, her voice gentle but firm. A second chance might set her right. Lord Harwood, moved by her plea and eager to avoid further scandal, agreed to a lenient resolution. He would settle the Carter family's debts, allowing Ellen's father to receive treatment on the condition that she resigned from service and leave the palace. Ellen, tears in her eyes, had accepted, her gratitude unspoken but evident. Antonio Rossi, cleared of involvement, returned to his kitchen with renewed bluster, though Miss Marple noted a quieter demeanor, as if the scrutiny had chastened him. His argument with Higgs, she learned, had indeed been over a delivery bill, but his debts hinted at pressures that might warrant watching. Lady Beatrice Langley, her pride intact but her composure shaken, had withdrawn to her rooms, her indignation at being suspected giving way to a grudging relief. Miss Marple suspected her gambling habits would persist, but for now, she was merely a bystander, her secret safe. The footman Thomas, whose hesitation had caught Miss Marple's eye, admitted, under Grayson's questioning too, overhearing Ellen's whispered fears about her family's debts. He had mentioned them to Villette, unaware of the diplomat's intentions, and his guilt was punishment enough. Miss Marple, recalling a similar case in St. Mary Mead, where a loose-tongued grocer had unwittingly aided a thief, advised Grayson to be gentle. He meant no harm, she said, and the inspector, softening, let the boy off with a warning. As the guests prepared to depart, Lord Harwood approached Miss Marple, his face a mix of gratitude and embarrassment. Miss Marple, you've done us a great service, he said, his voice low. I'd never have thought an old friend of my wife's could see so much. How did you know? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. Oh, my lord, it's only a matter of watching people. They're much the same everywhere. You, Nopolis, or village. A glance, a word, a moment's hesitation, they tell the story. She tucked her knitting into her bag, her smile serene. Grayson, joining them, tipped his hat. You've a knack for it, Miss Marple. I'll not underestimate you again. He paused, then added, if you ever tire of St. Mary Mead, Scotland Yard could use you. Miss Marple laughed softly, shaking her head. Oh, Inspector, I'm far too fond of my garden, but I'm glad to have helped. She rose, her shawl neatly draped, and made her way to the hall, where a car waited to take her to the station, as the train to St. Mary Mead carried her through the rolling countryside. Miss Marple gazed out the window, her mind lingering on the case. The tiara was safe, Ellen spared, Villette exposed, and the palace's secrets laid bare. Yet it was the small things, the unlatched window, the scratched lock, the empty bundle, that had led her to the truth. In Harwood Palace, as in her village, human nature was the key, its patterns as familiar as the stitches in her knitting. With a quiet smile, she opened her bag, her needles resuming their rhythm, ready for the next puzzle life might bring.